Once captives arrived at their destination, they were taken to market and put on display.
After 6 to 8 weeks aboard the ship, longer weather was particularly poor. The enslaved people arrived at a port in the Americas and were marched onto land. Many Africans didn't know what would happen next. Equiano recounts, "We thought by this we should be eaten by these ugly men as they appeared to us. And when soon after we were all put down under the deck again, there was much dread and trembling among us, and nothing but bitter cries to be heard all the night from these apprehensions, insomuch that at last the white people got some old slaves from the land to pacify us. They told us we were not to be eaten, but to work, and were soon to go on land, where we should see many of our country people. This report eased us much, and sure enough, soon after we were landed, there came to us Africans of all languages. We were conducted immediately to the merchant's yard, where we were all pent up together like so many sheep in a fold, without regard to sex or age.
If a captive refused to eat, they had food forced down their throat.
Keeping enslaved people alive was essential and very difficult. Given the conditions, so crew members did whatever it took to get them to eat. Their diet included bread, beans, and salted meat. If a person refused to eat, they were flogged, as much to punish them as to demonstrate to the other captives that resistance was not tolerated. The man refused to eat. He had been sick, reduced to a mere skeleton. He had apparently made a decision to die. Captain Timothy Tucker was outraged, and probably fearful, that his example might spread to the other 200+ captives aboard his ship, the Loyal George, as it made its way across the Atlantic to Barbados in the year 1727. The captain turned to his black cabin boy, Robin, and commanded him to fetch his whip. This was no cat o' nine tails, but rather something much bigger, a horsewhip. Crew members would also force-feed the slaves. They used a special piece of equipment called a speculum auris, the long, thin mechanical contraption used to force open unwilling throats to receive gruel and hence sustenance.
Women faced their own terrible conditions on the ships.
The majority of captives were men. They were deemed better for labor, but women were enslaved as well. On the slave ships, men and women were kept apart from one another. Women and girls were often not kept in chains like their male counterparts. And on some ships, the captain slept in a hammock over the girls. But women would often be sexually brutalized by the crew. John Newton tells a story of one of his crewmen assaulting a pregnant woman aboard his ship. William Cooney seduced a woman slave down into the room and lay with her brute-like in view of the whole quarter-deck, for which I put him in irons. I'll hope this has been the first affair of the kind on board, and I am determined to keep them quiet if possible. If anything happens to the woman, I shall impute it to him, for she was big with child.
The ships had suicide nets to prevent people from jumping overboard.
Given the chance, many enslaved people tried to kill themselves. This could be an act of desperation or defiance, or both. Captives would refuse to eat or try to poison themselves, as recounted by John Newton. They would also try to throw themselves into the sea. To prevent people from jumping overboard, many ships were outfitted with suicide nets. Even if someone could get through the nets, many ships would send boats out to bring them back. For the crew, they saw any enslaved person lost along the way as a reduction of profits.
Dysentery was a major cause of death during the 8-week voyage.
The deplorable conditions on slave ships lent themselves to the spread of disease, particularly dysentery, aka the Flogged. In his accounts from his time at sea, slave merchant John Newton describes numerous captives dying due to the flux and the fear of outbreaks sweeping over the ship. One former ship surgeon described the scene thus: the deck, that is the floor of their rooms, was so covered with the blood and mucus which had proceeded from them in consequence of the flux that it resembled a slaughterhouse. Other diseases, including scurvy, influenza, measles, malaria, and smallpox, were also common on ships. With disease around every turn, the mortality rate on slave ships was as high as 15%.
When the weather was bad, captives had to stay below deck in the heat and stink.
Captives were only allowed to go topside when the weather permitted. Otherwise, they stayed in the heat and stench below deck. With hundreds of people bound together in such a small space, Equiano said things became absolutely pestilential, as the conditions bred disease among the captives. The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate added to the number in the ship. This produced copious perspiration, so that the air soon became unfit for respiration from a variety of loathsome smells, and brought on a sickness amongst the slaves, of which many died.
If enslaved people disobeyed their captors, they were flogged.
The punishment for captives who didn't listen to the crew tried to escape. When he refused to eat, Equiano was punished by 2 men. One of them held me fast by the hands, and laid me across, I think, the windlass, and tied my feet, while the other flogged me severely. According to another source, if slaves refused to participate in their daily exercises, deemed necessary for the preservation of their health, if they go about it reluctantly or do not move with agility, they are flogged, a person standing by them all the time with a cat o' nine tails in his hands for the purpose. Branding and torture devices were also used to drive the enslaved people into submission. When insurrections broke out, and there were many slaves, would also be met with fierce punishment. Many captives had nothing to lose, however, and would rise up against the crew only to face cannon fire, muskets, and more bloodshed.
Below deck, the odor from feces, urine, and vomit was sickening.
Alana Equiano described what met him when he went below deck. I was soon put down under the decks, and there I received such a salutation in my nostrils as I had never experienced in my life, so that, with the loathsomeness of the stench and crying together, I became so sick and low that I was not able to eat. I now wished for the last friend, death, to relieve me. Slaves were sometimes taken above deck and bathed, weather permitting, but the periodic washings were no match for the brutal conditions.
Ships designed to carry a few hundred people transported as many as 700.
Slave ships were designed to carry hundreds of people, but were usually overcrowded in the interest of profit. The more slaves on a ship, the more money there was to be made. Captives were packed into the ship so tightly that they had no more than a few feet to move, sit, or sleep. Conditions were so cramped that those enslaved would not have been able to find a bucket to defecate or urinate in, thus forcing them to stay in their own waste. The Brooks ship, later a key part of the argument against the slave trade, depicted how slaves were to be put below deck and carried on slave ships. Prior to the passage of the Regulation Act of 1788, the Brooks carried over 700 slaves. The law was passed. Regulations restricted the number of captives aboard to about 450.
Captives were put onto the ships and chained below deck.
Captives were put onto the ships and chained below deck.
Captives were chained together and marched to the boats.
Captives were chained together and marched to the boats.
Africans were seized in raids or purchased from African slave traders.
Africans were seized in raids or purchased from African slave traders.
Hey guys, thank you so much for the support and likes and comments down below, and also thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to see you in the next video. Then take care, bye.